Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley. I'm an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach, and I have today with us Dr. Brian Licuanan. Brian is a speaker, an educator, an author, and a California board-certified psychologist. He has nearly 20 years of experience working with demographically diverse populations. He also has extensive experience treating a wide range of psychiatric conditions, including substance misuse, anxiety, and mood disorders. He's certified in cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, and specializes in insomnia and crisis family intervention. His new book is coming out this spring. It's called How to Get Your Resistant Loved One into Treatment, a Step-by-Step Plan for Mental Health and/or Addiction Crisis. This book is aimed at empowering families to give their loved ones another chance at starting over. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real honor. We have so many important topics to dive into today, but I'm just curious, tell us, how did you get from there to now 20 years of experience working in this field?
Yes, well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. Well, definitely, it's a great question. It definitely was not a straight journey for me, a straight path. I originally was looking into fields like law enforcement. I went through a stage of life where I just thought that was fascinating. So law enforcement, FBI was part of that. I did a stint at medical school, so I did a lot of the pre-medical stuff and wasn't a great fit for me. And I was actually in another PhD program in psychology. I knew psychology was the field to pursue. I just was very fascinated with the thinking process and what goes into psychology. And so I entered a program, a PhD program called Industrial Organizational Psychology. For people that aren't aware what that field entails, it has nothing to do with therapy. These are your consultants in the workplace, usually your human resource directors that look at behavior in the workplace, culture, communication, testing. They develop instruments for choosing the right employees. And I did that, and it wasn't a great fit for me again. And so luckily in that PhD program, the requirements were to take some classes in the counseling department. And I was doing clinical work per se as a client coordinator for a residential facility for adolescents. And I just always was comfortable there. And when I was taking those classes and then realizing that that field wasn't a good fit for me, I realize that this is the transition I need to make. And so I finished a master's in that program, and the thought of having to start over was I got over that for about 48 hours. And then I transitioned to the clinical department and received my PhD there. And so I haven't looked back, and I finally found, I believe, the field of work that's in line with my values and principles, and I believe my skill set. So I'm very happy where I ended up. So yes, that has been my journey to how I got here today.
Yeah, a bit of roller coastering there, but it's helpful. Like, that's such a great example, I think, for people to hear that you don't have to settle in one space, especially if you did all that schooling and then you essentially, kind of started over. That's beautiful because it really gives people the hope to keep following that passion and that purpose until you find something, right, that sticks. Because a lot of people would have looked at that and said, "Oh, all these sunk costs that I have in it, right? So I'm just going to
Oh,
stay
I
here."
went through my mind, believe me.
It's hard. It's hard to let go of something. It's great though when you're grasping onto something that's really helpful. So I love that. So let's dive in here first. If you could just kind of talk us through the trauma impact, the effects. I mean, we're talking big things, mental health crises, insomnia, you talk about a lot, substance misuse, or even addiction, right? What is the effect when trauma survivors kind of lean into some of these really debilitating, unhealthy coping skills and kind of end up in these really difficult places?
Well, what happens with traumas, especially these significant events that really impair your life in many ways, especially if they're not worked through on an emotional level, depression, anxiety, paranoia, to a physical level, lack of sleep, not eating correctly, engaging in substances on a social level. Traumatic experience can create isolation, mistrust for others. And so you create this, the biggest thing that can happen with traumas is this representation of the world. In some research, we call it schematic representations. And as a way to protect yourself from a trauma, what happens a lot that we find is the body and mind create this absolute mind thinking, right? If you get bitten by a dog, what's the first reaction? All dogs are dangerous. And if we don't work through that, time later, it's not just about dogs, it's about cats, it's about other animals, and it's all those things. And so that's one of the biggest things that happens with trauma survivors is as I believe what's an initial a protective mode that we talk in these absolutes as always, and it's so for all things are going to hurt me. But when we don't shut that down, and we don't shut that down, brain chemistry, everything about us changes, and that's distress. And so what happens a lot is people will find ways to relieve stress. And the reality is there's healthy ways to relieve stress, to bring us back to balance. And there's unhealthy ways to bring back balance in our life. We call that homeostasis, equilibrium, or balance. And substances are one of those reality. One thing I talk about, the reason why people engage in substances is because it works. Right? You wouldn't be doing it if it didn't work. Right. It works for what it was originally intended, but through time, as you create tolerance and so forth, it becomes counterproductive and diminishing returns, right? If you drank alcohol to take the edge off anxiety, to sleep better, one glass of wine's not going to do it. Now you need two and three, and then becomes counterproductive because it changes your brain chemistry further. You become dependent. So, but trauma is one thing I want to say for your listeners as well is I've worked with quite a few really traumatic cases, and the reality is people can get through traumas. That's one of the biggest things. The installation of hope is people can get better, and people feel helpless and hopeless through traumatic experiences, and they feel like they'd have to do it on their own. And I can't stress enough, one of the best ways to start on that path of healing is to tell on yourself is I need help. It's humility, meaning that, hey, not to have that pride and say, I need help. And so, but yeah, that's kind of how the cycle works. And it's not just substances, right? Coping mechanisms could be isolation. It could be hypersexuality. It could be undereating, overeating. It could be a lot of things that we engage in, overworking at a job. And so that's kind of what I work with people is number one, validating their experience, but changing their mindset, especially that they're not falling down this absolute view of the world, and to also find ways to cope and to kind of mitigate some of those distressful symptoms.
Yeah. Two things that I absolutely adore there is that you are kind of toting the same message that I just wish we could just have on every billboard in America, that healing is possible. I don't care what you've been through. Healing is actually possible. It's not easy. There's no other word except for possible because it's difficult. I call it a labyrinth. It's never ending, but like it is actually possible, and you can be working toward a better homeostasis, which is one of my favorite words, homeostasis.
Yeah.
But I love the way that you're calling these with these protective mechanisms, right? And so long-term listeners are going to know I love that word because I'm IFS informed. So I do internal family systems with my clients and for myself. And we all know Dr. Richard Schwartz says there are no bad parts. They all have an originally good intention of trying to keep you safe and trying to take care of you and to help you to survive. So I can appreciate these things being original protective mechanisms, and they seem like they're ways to cope, but then the unhealthiness coming from them, we want to be able to find new coping skills. So your big work is like working with the friends and family, or at least specifically this book too, the friends and family, the loved ones of people who are stuck in these ruts. What are some of their obstacles that they're going through? Because your book, you call it resistant loved one, right? Like, what does that mean? You know, they tried everything and nothing's worked, so they're giving up, or they just don't believe that they are worth finding help. What is that family dynamic happening?
Well, all of those factors that you mentioned absolutely fall under that umbrella of reasons why people don't get help. And so where my book came to be was I also facilitate a support group for the past almost 15 years for families who are in crisis. Their loved ones don't think they have a problem. They are resisting help. They're homeless. They're in hospitals, or they're at home and they don't think their substance abuse issue is problematic. And what happened over the years of facilitating this group and working in residential treatment in my own um, private practice therapies when working with clients is the same questions come up consistently, repeatedly, the same themes. We don't know what to do. We feel powerless. We feel hopeless. They don't think they have a problem, or they need to hit a certain proverbial rock bottom, which is
Right.
not a bad word, right? But to me, I just believe rock bottom sometimes for people that understand that they may think of it as a different way, such as tough love, right? Tough loves comes from a meaning place, but sometimes what I talk about is sometimes family members not fully versed on that will look at that as tough luck, meaning that, and we know when someone is really struggling and feel helpless and hopeless, when people abandon them, that opens the door for or unhealthiness, whether it be suicidality, giving up hope, and so forth. And so that what I found a lot is there's a lot of gaps out there. There's a lot of well-meaningful knowledge out there, be tough on them. If they have to hit a certain point, just disconnect with them, right? And what I found was there's all these knowledge out there, but not really a how-to. But I was finding that there was a lot of, I believe, missing components in there. You can still, what I call assertive love, number one. It's the type of relationship where there's a balance between having rules in relationship. And I call it assertive love, right? And so, yes, that could mean tough love in some respects. But I wanted to do, what I found was a lot of these families coming to my support groups or in residential treatment as they hear these terms and then they take it literally, and what happens is just perpetuates the family unhealthiness and the person not getting help. For example, enabling, I talk about, I write in my book that enabling is not a curse word. I have 25 must knows that I feel like are the recurring themes and knowledges that families struggle with. And one of them is recognize that enabling is not a curse word. It comes from a place of love, right? When your loved one doesn't have food, you give them nourishment. If they don't have a home, you give them shelter. If they don't have a car, you give them resources. However, enabling can perpetuate the unhealthiness, right? If someone loses a job repeatedly because they have struggles with communication, keep giving them money and not allowing them to work perpetuates unhealthiness. The enabling part is, yeah, that's what we do. It's just that it perpetuates the problem. And so we can still come from a place of love, but also maintain healthy relationships and boundaries as well.
Wow. What does that look like, right? Because you're like this tough love or assertive love, as you call it, which is just so difficult to do. And some people want to not teeter all the way to like abandonment, right? Because then the person that they want to help, if they feel that abandonment or rejection, like you said, that can catapult them into some more negative behavior. But then you don't want to be on the other spectrum of enabling. So those boundaries, are they boundaries for the person who's helping them? Are they boundaries for the type of help they're giving? What does that look like?
Again, you're hitting all the points again. Both of those are very correct. And
I'm
so,
just guessing.
yeah. And one thing, just to back up a little bit, the impetus of my book, I've been wanting to have this book for a long time, but of course things come up and never got to it. Actually, it was the pandemic that got me to write the book because I was, if you recall, during March of 2020, things were changing and I was getting cancellation upon cancellation upon cancellation because for whatever reason, people were sick, they were worried. And I was just sitting at my desk here and I was just looking at the window and I said, you know what? Now it's time to start. And I literally just started typing on my computer about it. And there's all this knowledge that just came out of, and it wasn't brand new knowledge. It was the narrative of what I've been telling these families all along. It was like as if I was in the meeting and just typing it out in that very same order. And I didn't realize how formulaic it was. But so Sarah, take me back. What was that question again?
What do the boundaries look like?
Oh, boundaries look like.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I mentioned where the pandemic came is what I realized out of that silver lining, and there are silver linings, believe it or not, during the global pandemic, was the human condition in choices. When you take someone's choice away from them, as a human condition, I believe we resist. Wear the mask, don't wear the mask. Social distance, don't social distance. Get the shot, don't take the shot. And what I believe is what you saw was there was a lot of resistance. And so I was thinking about that and how that relates to how families can set healthy boundaries with people. And when you tell someone you can never drink again, you can never not take your meds again, what you tell them is that you have the freedom of choice. It's just that we're communicating what we're willing to participate and be a part of,
Right.
right? It's say, hey, we're going to be here for you, but we're not going to support your continued alcohol use, your continued blaming and yelling at us. And so you give them a choice. Like I said, when you tell someone that what they can and cannot do, the resistance is already there. And so when you communicate that boundaries, here's where the assertive love comes. We love you. We're going to be here for you. It's just that we are not going to support that lifestyle any longer. And what happens a lot with the enabling part is, especially when someone's not well, when we allow them to engage in that unhealthiness in some way or mind, they believe that if their issues aren't that bad or it's okay. Okay. And so that really reinforces that something's not right and that we are going to support you, but we're being very clear on what we're going to be a part of and not be a part of.
Yeah. So it's really about the languaging, letting them know that
Mhm.
this is a boundary that I have for myself and the rest of the family so we can be protected, to make sure that we aren't enabling you in negative behavior. We want to support you in healthy behaviors.
Mhm.
But one would be enabling and one would be supporting, as long as the behaviors are still there. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. When you've talked a couple of times about like this changing like the mindset, and I think this probably it probably is for the families that are going through this with their loved one and the loved one going through the crisis also, right? Like, how do you help people shift? You call it the winning mindset, right? So like, how are you helping people shift that mindset when things look, rock bottom, really, really desolate, and sometimes on the brink, really, especially when it comes to mental health crisis and suicidality? How does that shift happen for people?
Well, the shift, if I can back up a little bit, I believe most things in life are on a spectrum,
Yeah.
right? There's really anything that's on a dichotomy, even someone masculine or feminine, that's on a spectrum. And
Right.
so same thing with where does that happen? It comes on a spectrum. There are some families where they're at the point where they get it, right? They're there, and some people it's a gradual process. But one of the biggest things, and one of the things I'm talking about is the level of acceptance. Acceptance to me is
Yeah.
to be at peace with something for able to move on. And sometimes there are things that we're accepting the death of a loved one, accepting of a job loss, a breakup in a relationship. And sometimes, as we know, in many and the theories out there, radical acceptance is this high level degree of acceptance that we need to do. We just have to do it. It's just like this extreme uber like level of acceptance.
Yeah.
Another thing that I do, so that's one thing that I help work with families is recognizing that. And the bigger thing too is this level of powerlessness that we have. A lot of times, so powerless, we hear that in the recovery, substance recovery arena. And sometimes people have different ideas of what that means. So some people, they struggle with powerlessness means I'm weak. I said, no, powerless just means that I respect the capabilities of this thing I'm up against: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolarity, substance abuse, and that I can't do this thing on my own. So that's what powerless means. And so one thing I help with families recognize is that you're powerless over this disease, so to speak. And you sometimes families over assume how much power they have in a situation. And so if you're familiar with the serenity prayer, right? Serenity prayer is, for those listeners that aren't aware, it goes, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And it's not so much a spiritual God prayer, it's a wise saying. And what it's basically saying is, grant me the peace to accept the things I don't have power over. Give me the strength to have any control of the things I do have power over, and to recognize what I do and do not have any power over.
Right.
And I think that has been a huge, huge mantra for people who feel like they're helpless and hopeless. And what happens is when we enable is, like I said, we're over assuming how much power we have in the situation, and we're depriving the person of doing the work. We're on their side of the street, and what we're doing is we're relinquishing and giving that, empowering them and the family at the same time, because that's what the disease wants. Disease is not just a psychiatric condition. It's not just a substance abuse issue. Of course, diabetes is a disease. COVID is a disease. Alcoholism, depression, disease. The 7 deadly sins if it causes problems in your life, that's your version of disease, meaning that we all have a disease or diseases, and so we're all in some form of recovery. So that's how I help people is recognize you are powerless over this disease, because the disease wants to fracture, it wants to isolate, it wants to replicate. That's where it's most powerful. It hates fellowship. It hates when you are surrounded with healthiness, and that's what its job to do, is isolate. And so back to your question, is really huge. Radical acceptance as needed, and recognizing what I do and don't have any power over.
Yeah, what a change in thinking from powerless just to recognizing, yeah, you might need some support in this area. You can bring back some of that control. I hear the words that I use a lot are autonomy or agency, right? So like working with trauma survivors in the coaching realm, you know, especially if they had childhood trauma, right? Like their agency as a child was taken away, their voice, like they didn't get to choose or pick, right? They had to do the survival thing in the survival moment just to keep it going, right? And their brain just one track mind. And now it's like, wait, I have choices. Wait, I can make this decision.
Yes.
I can actually decide if this is even a battle that I'm ready to start fighting. Someone might be trying to let go of a negative coping skill and kind of move into a different mindset, but like they get to choose that, and they get to choose when they're ready for that. So I know the power of giving someone back their own autonomy, giving them back their agency and their voice. So that sounds like it translates into the work that you're doing there. I am going to imagine that in this space, there's a lot of fear that comes up, especially with the families. What do you hear are some of those top fears that when they're coming to you for help with their loved ones?
Well, the biggest fears are, can they ever change? Can they ever get better? But one of the biggest things that I educate people on, I believe, you have to accept I call the inevitable consequences to untreated mental health or addiction, substance addiction, or any type of addiction as well. It's for untreated, is you have to accept your loved one can end up in jail or hospital. They can end up in jail, and they can lose their life or take someone else's life. And I say homelessness is temporary. Eventually, in homelessness, you'll end up in jail, hospital, or you can lose your life or take someone's life as well. And so those are the inevitable consequences we have to accept, because of course, the last one there is the fear of losing a loved one. I'm a parent, and one of the biggest resounding themes of parents is biggest fear, which is mine as well, is to ever outlive your children. And of course, human nature, mother nature, what have you, it's not really the way it's supposed to be, but the reality is it happens that way. But right there is what happens is, so we protect them. And what happens is we perpetuate their illness. And the longer someone stays in this state of unhealthiness, the sicker they get and the harder it is to recover. And so yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we can do as family members, is to give them back that power, because when you give them that power and support, they start to have hopefulness and a concept called self-efficacy, which is a belief that someone could be successful. And so, but yes.
Can I rewind for a second? Can you kind of speak on, so we're talking about like acceptance, radical acceptance of these potential inevitable consequences, which could be all the way the loss of this person that they are trying to save. It's almost like what does that acceptance look like? Are they like preparing to grieve? Are they preparing to be okay if it happens? How does that live in the same existence as trying to stay hopeful and prayerful and trying to be on top of all of these things and move forward while this is a potential inevitability?
That's a good question, and that is definitely a very, 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 very important question. And that's one of the common struggles that people have, is that on the same level, you're asking me to accept the death of a loved one, child, grandchild, spouse, but you also want me to remain hopeful. And there has to be a trust in a greater process. whether it be the treatment process, whether it be the recovery process. For some people, a higher power, some people, it's Mother Nature. There has to be some trust in a greater process. And like I said, one of those is just the recovery. And I believe with all the elements that come under recovery. So recovery, first we think of is a substance abuse issue or some injury. But recovery, we're all in recovery, is just a plan in place for healthier living and outcomes. So we all have our version of diseases, like I mentioned earlier, and so we're on some form of recovery. But that's a very difficult one. And I think the acceptance part of if someone can lose their life, if you truly believe that there is a process out there, and in this case, it's called recovery, and we believe that it can truly work, that helps mitigate or inoculate a little bit of that fears of losing someone. Because like I said, the longer someone stays in that state, the probability of something deleterious or tragic heightens. It's about lowering those risk factors. And for example, I have families where they know their daughter is downstairs drinking alcohol and taking Xanax, but as long as she's not being sex trafficked or raped, right? Or I know my son is in his apartment, he's not using the money for college, and he's using it for substances, but as long as he has a place to stay. Right. I know, and so we see that a lot, and all we're doing is we are amplifying the disease and the sickness. And the longer they stay in that unhealthy state, the harder it is to get them out of that. And by the way, speaking of hopefulness, neuroplasticity, if you're familiar, for your listeners out there, neuroplasticity is this theory that our brains can heal. Our brains can heal and create new memories and new connections. As long as we're living on this earth, doesn't matter what, our brains have that capacity to heal. That is a big hopefulness that I share with family members. Well, how can my son get better? He's been using meth since he was 15 years old. Or how can my daughter get better? She's been abandoned and abused, since she was a teenager. And neuroplasticity is a very, very powerful and hopeful term for people out there who've survived trauma. Is we wouldn't be here for 100,000 years if we weren't resilient physically, mentally, and neuroplasticity is a very hopeful point. So there's a lot of ways that, back to your question of how to counteract some of those biggest fears. But this disease, I talk about the disease is like a car. It's oil and gas, is guilt and fear. And fear is not bad, neither is guilt. But when it's at a high level for a long period of time, it's debilitating. And so that's where I see most people struggle to get their loved ones help. And where they stay unhealthy is we're at fear. And so
for people listening who are thinking about their loved ones and they're saying, I know I need to do something, but I don't know what to do. What would be just a first couple of really practical steps for them?
As a family unit, be honest, right? You have to be honest. I talk about H2O, right, is what I call the disease's vaccine, right? And so H2O, we know water, right? H2O water is essential for life, right? But H2O to me, there's three elements that I believe, I call it the disease vaccine. And the first H stands for honesty. You have to be honest with yourself and others. If you're not, you're harboring secrets, and secrets can turn into resentments. And the resentments almost always, at the end of the day, turn back at your oneself. But honesty is the biggest thing, because if you're not honest, it's the very most important element of change. So that's number one, is you have to get honest with yourself and with the family. Second H is humility. Humility is not having pride or ego, right? It's because what happens, you underestimate the capabilities of what you're up against. And so you have to be humble as well. And then lastly, the O stands for open to direction, is you have to be open to direction, open to feedback, because we have to be humble enough that what we've been doing hasn't been working. So I believe those are the most critical elements for family units, is get honest. Because when they're not honest with the family, they're in denial, they're not thinking they have a problem, then that greatly impedes the ability to get on this traction of the person getting better or the family unit getting better.
Yeah. And I would think too, bringing it out into that fresh space is also helping lower that shame and that guilt that the family is feeling when we're saying, listen, this is just what happened. We're not going to blame anyone here, but this is what's going on. This is where we're at, the reality, right? And I love the humility, the humbleness coming in, because otherwise you wouldn't ask for help.
Yep.
If you were like, oh, no, we've got this. It's a family problem.
Exactly.
We've got this. That's where being open to direction is even possible. Yeah. That's really
Yeah.
cool. Brian,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. I always like to ask all of our guests, and this could be maybe some tools and resources that you've used along the way that have helped you in your practice, or help, your nervous system remain calm while you're working with all these beautiful families, or some resources that would be helpful to people that are listening, ways that they can reach out, hotlines, agencies that you know of, just a few resources that would be really important for people.
Okay, well, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is a very great resource, NAMI for short.
Yeah.
It's, I think, one of the largest organizations that provide services for family members or people struggling with mental health or substance abuse issues. They provide various levels of support groups for people struggling, to family support groups, to workshops, education. So NAMI.org, O-R-G, N-A-M-I, .org is a great place to start.
Nice.
Even the World Health Organization has a lot of mental health resources. Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, DBSA, is also another great resource. And don't underestimate the value of Google. There's a lot of resources out there, helplines, resources. So definitely utilize that as a first line of defense of education.
Yeah, especially for finding help in your local areas as well.
Sure.
That's where
Yeah.
Google will be tracking where you're at. So that's excellent. Brian, thank you again so much. Please tell people where they can find you, where they can find your book, and I'll have this all linked up in the show notes below.
Oh, great. So my website is, I'll spell it as well, drbrianlicuanan.com. Well, Dr. D.R. Brian, B-R-I-A-N, last name spelled L-I-C as in cat, U-A-N as in Nancy, A-N as in Nancy.com. And there's no space, no period between that. So that's one way. And also at Dr. Licuanan, same spelling for TikTok. And then my book will be available. It's aimed to be published this spring, more leaning towards April. So that will be available on Amazon and various other places where you can purchase books as well.
Excellent. And you have some info about it on your website as well. So I'll link up that page on the show notes so they can follow that, because I believe pre-orders coming soon. So yeah, that'll be coming out very, very soon. That's excellent. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate you spending the time, taking the time and doing the really important work that you're doing for families. So thank you so
Thank you. And I appreciate the way you're doing as well.
Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your night. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.